All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to our 5th webinar as part of our National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative. This is Kevin Moss with Troy Timmons and Bill Whitaker from the Western Governors Association. And this webinar, An All Lands Approach to Grazing Management, is going to explore creative and flexible solutions to grazing management challenges between a variety of federal and state agencies in Idaho. If you need any technical assistance during the webinar, the best way to get in touch with me if you can't hear the audio or something like that is to use the chat box function. I'll be listed as danbear/host on the right side, and you can send me a private message if you're having technical difficulty. You can also call the WGA office at 303-623-9378, and we'll do our best to help you out. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Troy Timmons to give some more background about our National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative.
Great, thanks, Kevin. The initiative was the hallmark initiative of our previous chair, Governor Steve Bullock of Montana, and when he took over as chair of the Western Governors Association, he wanted us to look into how forest and rangeland management is conducted in Western states. Asked us to look at 4 things in particular. The first was primarily to give states a chance to talk to each other about what's working and what's not working in how forest and rangeland management is conducted. The second thing was to look at the role of collaboratives and collaborative engagement in how land management decisions are made, and the role of those local community activities in promoting responsible and good management practices. The third was to look at the different tools that were passed as part of the 2014 Farm Bill. Things like insect and disease designation and stewardship contracting and good neighbor authority, and how those have contributed to better management practices. And then the fourth thing was after looking at all of that, what could be done both within state agencies, federal agencies, and then what could be done from a federal legislative standpoint to facilitate further improvements to those management practices. One of the things that we talked about at the workshops that were conducted as part of last year's first year of the initiative was the use of grazing as a management tool, and that fits right into the webinar that we're holding right now. Idaho has done some really unique, or has put together a really unique approach to how to use grazing to accomplish multiple different management objectives, and importantly, to do it across different ownership boundaries, private landowners, state lands, federal lands, and that type of cooperation is exactly the kind of forward-looking and forward-thinking management activity that we want to dive into as part of the initiative. So I'm really looking forward to what Curtis and our panelists have for us today. This sounds like and should be a really innovative approach to how grazing contributes to a host of different management objectives. So I'm really looking forward to it. Right now I'll turn it back over to Kevin for some final thoughts before we get to our panelists. Really appreciate all of you folks that are part of this discussion and that are listening in. We really appreciate the time that you're taking to join us today. So thank you. And
Great.
Kevin.
Thanks, Troy. So the way this is going to flow is we're going to begin with opening statements from Curtis and then our host of panelists. And after that, we'll move into a moderated discussion between Curtis and the panelists. And then our final step is going to be a question and answer session from the audience. So the way that'll run is you guys can send in questions through the chat box, and then myself and the rest of the WGA staff are going to kind of sort through those and pass them along to Curtis. And Curtis really wants a pretty lively discussion, so we want to highly encourage all of you to send in lots of questions. And you don't need to do that at the very end. You can send in questions as we have our discussion. So hopefully we can have a good little roundtable through that process. And with that, I want to give a little bit more background about Curtis. Curtis has been the state conservationist for the NRCS in Idaho for over 2 years now, and he has worked generally with the NRCS for over 20 years. Curtis has been associated with farming and ranching all his life and was a crucial leader in the signing of the White Issue Paper between federal and state agencies in Idaho to investigate more flexible grazing management plans across ownership boundaries. I would like to thank Curtis and all of our panelists for participating on this webinar and for lending their expertise to our National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative. With that, Curtis, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Curtis Elke. I'm the State Conservationist for the USDA-Natural Resources Conservation Service. I also want to thank the Western Governors and the Association for all their support and for this opportunity to share our valued shared visions and anticipated outcomes implementing grazing management collaboratively across all lands. So thank you and good morning, everyone. So almost a year ago now, I met with some of my federal, state, and non-government organization NGO partners at a partnership breakfast where the mention was brought up how great it would be to provide our landowners more regulatory certainty and more flexible alternatives to providing grazing management across all lands, public and private. But we all agreed that this is the time to act while all federal, state, and local partners have never been so strongly associated in support of each other here in Idaho in our mission. So this gave me the green light to coordinate a group of people and help develop a white issue paper with many of our partners, as I spoke about, to seek outcome-based, common sense solutions that provide additional flexibilities and benefits to the landowners across all lands. So some of the partners I want to mention this morning and give credit to that have contributed and supported this concept over the course of a year now include the Idaho Governor's Office of Species Conservation, the BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, University of Idaho Rangeland Center, the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission, Idaho Fish and Game, Idaho Department of Agriculture, the Idaho Department of Lands, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Forest Service, the Idaho Association for Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and the Idaho Conservation Commission. There's many others that have also shown interest and plan to be part of this collaboration, including and most importantly, landowners. Buy-in on the part of the livestock producer, landowner permittee is the most critical element, in my opinion and others, to the process of developing solutions that fit their operation and improve the ecological and economic benefit across the landscape. So, a little bit about Idaho. According to the National Ag Statistics Service in 2015, gross cattle sales were nearly $2 billion in Idaho. We take it serious. The ecological and the economic benefits that grazing management brings Idaho is huge. Idaho, in fact, is the third largest agriculture state in the West. By the year 2050, it's estimated and anticipated there will be an additional 2.5 billion people in the world to feed. Some of you may have heard that statistic before. So we have an extremely important role to provide food and fiber while sustaining our natural resources for future generations. Effective land management is so critical to our communities nationwide, and I just want to say, wow, what an opportunity we have right now to make a difference. So it really pleases me to say that positive outcomes are already happening in this state. and probably other states out there as well that I'm unaware of. In fact, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, just announced a new pilot project, which June is going to be talking about, I'm sure, momentarily here. They just announced this new pilot project that will grant grazing permit holders and agency personnel increased flexibility to design custom grazing strategies that achieve positive ecological outcomes. This is very, very, very exciting. That I applaud the BLM for thinking outside the box and seeking a seamless approach for ecological and economic benefits across all lands. Our optimal goal here is to create a collaborative process that offers positive outcomes for the landowner and the landscape. So today, we have the pleasure of having on our panel this morning Mr. Dustin Miller, who's the lead administrator for the Idaho Governor's Office of Species Conservation. We have Karen Launchbaugh. She's the director of the University of Idaho Rangeland Center. We have June Shoemaker, the Deputy State Director for Resource Services with the Idaho BLM. And we also have Chris Black, who's an Idaho rancher and a chairman of the Idaho Rangeland Resources Commission Board of Directors. So we have the federal, state, local, and landowner all represented here on this webinar, which I'm really excited for. So with that, I guess I'd like to take a moment to have each of our distinguished panelists introduce themselves and share with us a little bit about their history and the position that they have towards all lands grazing management. So with that, I'll allow Karen, if you're ready, to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your position with all lands grazing management.
Yes, Curtis, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I also have a few slides that I think Kevin is going to put up for me. I thought I'd start out just by backing up a little bit and thinking about where we're at in the process. I'm going to talk mostly about what is being termed outcome-based land management. It's just one of those many terms, and one of the challenges of trying to create flexibility and opportunities is that this thing is known by many different names. It's called lands approach, conservation, grazing, and now outcome-based management. So on my slide here, I put a picture of a sunrise just to remember that, hey, we're at the beginning of trying to frame up what outcome-based land management is, but it's just a step along several long journeys that we've been doing in Idaho that relate to collaborative resource management and others. So I will describe a little bit how I see outcome-based management as different than some of these other approaches. I do appreciate the idea that we're really talking about trying to really empower people that are on the ground with some flexibility, no matter where we sit. So I sit in the Rangeland Center up here at the U of I, but our members are from all across the state, extension and researchers, and our motto is science and solutions for the range. So I hope we can find some solutions in this process. That's my goal. One of our newest projects then is to really frame out, working with BLM and others to frame out this idea of outcome-based land management. And I'm happy that Dennis Becker, who is a member of the Range Center, but also director of the policy analysis group here, is taking on a project where he's bringing folks together. If you haven't heard about this or haven't been involved, you're going to be hearing about it soon. That group is bringing together people on the ground to identify the obstacles, the challenges, and the opportunities to think about outcome-based land management. He's working closely with Don Freemuth in the Andrus Center. So you will probably be hearing more from those guys soon. So as we go along this journey, go ahead and give me the next slide then. How is outcome-based land management different from others? Well, range management is, no matter what, it's always just been a planning process where you have something current and you're trying to get to something future. The challenge in the past has been that we focus a lot on the prescriptions, that arrow, like how many cattle to graze, when to graze them. And we didn't always think about what the outcomes are. So outcome-based land management is really to try to keep reminding us to focus on ecological, economic, and social goals, and to overcome obstacles and seize opportunities. So next slide. there is a whole area of research that is on collaborative resource management. And although you could do outcome-based management without any collaboration with your neighbors, it would be really difficult because to do this well, you got to have ideas, knowledge, and opportunities on the table, and those come from the people around it. So just by its nature, outcome-based land management, although we're going to slide in, talk a lot today about maybe say federal grazing permits, by its nature, it's going to be inherently collaborative and landscape scale across land ownerships, which Curtis, in your white paper, you outlined really well, this idea that ecological processes happen at landscape scales across land ownerships. So last slide then, this is my take-home message, and then I look forward to the other presentation or the other discussions, is that we do need to think big scale to create opportunities. So Lou Lunte, a good friend of mine, always says that we should think about resources or opportunities at scales that matter. So those are large scales, allotments, ranches, watersheds, because not until you get to big scales do you have opportunities across land ownerships. So that's the common thread between outcome-based land management and all lands approaches. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Karen. And Karen's been extremely instrumental in moving this forward in her leadership, and so much appreciated. So thank you, Karen. So with that, let's move on to June Shoemaker, and the Deputy State Director for Resources Services for the Idaho BLM.
Great. Hi, Chris. So hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to chat with you all today. So as Curtis said, my name is June Shoemaker. I'm the Deputy State Director for Resources and Sciences at the Idaho State Office for the Bureau of Land Management. I've been in Idaho now for about a year and a half. I'm a Boise State grad though, so I'm kind of coming back home. And I've been BLM for about 10 years, and I've worked in a couple different states and also back in Washington, D.C. So BLM Idaho is, we actually have one of the largest range programs in the BLM organization, and so we understand the critical importance of working with local, state, and federal partners, and we're very blessed in Idaho to have a framework and a network that really promotes that and actually allows us to really do some innovative things and work on some really interesting stuff. The focus we really have is on sustainable grazing that really can provide us with the desired resource, social, and economic outcomes. Thanks. Similar to what Karen already mentioned, we understand we really need to be much more flexible and be able to be responsive to weather, range conditions, market conditions, all of the pieces and parts that make up that work. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. The other piece of this is collaboration is key. It takes a lot of time, but it creates strong support for our decisions and ultimately durability for those decisions, which is something that's really important. We also spend a lot of time working through litigation, so the more people we can have at the table to have those conversations early on and provide that buy-in and that support ultimately helps us in being successful at the end of the day. So this whole idea of outcome-based management, outcome-based grazing, what is it? Well, we're still working on it. We're still working on what that thing actually is. And within the organization, we're really working through a cultural shift away from the prescription aspect of grazing permits and land permits and really working more towards resource outcomes. So the administration goal is promoting a shared stewardship. So I think Curtis mentioned that we just recently, there's a news release that came out. We are looking for about a dozen outcome-based grazing pilot projects across the entire national BLM. And really, the focus of those projects are going to be landscape level, so they really do work across boundaries. It's not just the BLM public land. They have to be collaborative. The more people we have involved in the conversations of what those outcomes need to be on those pieces of land is really going to be critical to the success of that program. We also need to focus on local solutions. We hear a lot that there's a lot of top-down sort of management that comes, and this is something that is really important for us here in Idaho, that we really need to engage the folks that know what needs to happen on the ground, and so they're really a critical part of that conversation. And then also working through the barriers. Right now we have regulations that tend to box us in a lot of the time, and so we're really hoping that we can push the edges of where we're at to be able to test sort of what we can do within our current regulations, and then identify where we have needs to make those changes, and then work with folks in our Washington office and our national office to be able to try to affect those changes and build some flexibility into our regulations. So just a couple little take-home things I wanted to throw out. No one-size-fits-all approach ever really works, and I think that's something that we really want to focus on and make that a tenet of how we move forward. Collaborative conservation isn't easy. It needs patience and commitment, and I think we definitely have the commitment and working on the patience here in Idaho. And then also just to keep in mind that we're kind of figuring this out as we go. Management plans that include ecological and socioeconomic goals, they're largely untested. So we're sort of putting a toe in the water and trying this out and developing those relationships as we go. So, thanks, Curtis. Thank you for letting me be here and participate.
Thank you, Jane. So the gentleman that I am, I allowed the women to go first. I don't know if any of you noticed that or not. Anyway, let's move on to Mr. Dustin Miller, who's the lead administrator for the Idaho Governor's Office of Species Conservation.
All right. Well, thank you, Curtis, and we appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this panel today, this very important panel. And for those of you out there listening, yeah, this really is me, but I failed to follow Mindy's instructions to register before I came, so I'm not documented as a speaker, but this really is me. But I'll follow directions better next time, Mindy. But we really appreciate Curtis's work on this all lands approach to grazing management, because it's something that's really important to the states as well as, of course, the federal government and our livestock grazing permittees and others. I guess by way of introduction, again, my name is Dustin Miller, and I'm the administrator for the Governor's Office of Species Conservation, located here in Boise, Idaho. Our focus really, by statute, is to coordinate and implement policies and programs related to the conservation and recovery of species listed as threatened, endangered, or candidate under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Also, another focus are those species that aren't quite listed but are species of concern, rare and declining species, and generally fish and wildlife species that really need some attention to ensure that we do what we can to preclude the need to list. We also work to balance conservation strategies with maintaining the vitality, customs, and the culture of the state of Idaho. That's very important to strike that appropriate balance. We also engage partners in conservation efforts to help recover and eventually delist federally protected species or preclude the need to list. And we also work to find solutions for those in the regulated community who are often impacted by the regulatory burdens associated with species listings and subsequent critical habitat designations. So it's really a big mission. Oftentimes it's easier said than done to accomplish our goals and objectives. But through these collaborative partnerships, we accomplish great things here in Idaho. We don't always agree with some of our partners, but we will agree to disagree and move forward for the betterment of the health of the ecosystem, as well as those utilizing the resource out there. So how does the Office of Species Conservation relate to this all lands approach to grazing management? This really goes back to that mission of trying to find that appropriate balance. We feel that fish and wildlife populations fare a lot better under state management than they do under federal management. And that's really one of our focuses is ensuring that we're applying the appropriate level of conservation on the landscape to do just that, to keep fish and wildlife populations under state management. But healthy landscapes benefit wildlife and people. I think with the USDA sage grouse initiative, and there I said it, I can't get through a presentation anymore without saying sage grouse. But one of the mantras is what's good for the bird is good for the herd, and vice versa. And I truly believe that, as would most of our livestock operators in the state. Healthy rangelands are important for the economic prosperity of the ranching community, but certainly very important for maintaining viable populations of fish and wildlife. This, of course, is something that we feel is best done through a collaborative approach. And if you look at this all lands approach, the majority of the habitat, and I'm looking at, the sage steppe ecosystem. Most of that ecosystem in Idaho is managed by the federal government. But we're looking at 350 plus different wildlife species that call that sage steppe ecosystem home. And, we've got state lands intermixed, obviously, with the federal land and private lands. And so that all lands network approach and that conservation approach across that landscape is vitally important because of seasonal habitat considerations for not only sage grouse, but mule deer or pygmy rabbits or you name it, what's out there. Private lands provide very important habitat for greater sage grouse and other species, particularly in summer months. And of course, BLM lands are very important for sage grouse, oftentimes for breeding and nesting and winter habitat. And so this all lands approach is vitally important, and I think through this approach we're going to continue to accomplish a lot of good things in Idaho for the betterment of fish and wildlife and for various user groups using the resource out there. Our primary threats to this sage steppe ecosystem is fire invasive species, and I think through innovative approaches to livestock grazing and management, we can really reshift the conversation and focus on utilizing livestock grazing as really more of a necessary tool in helping us deal with these challenges with fire and invasive species on this ecosystem. Flexibility in timing, duration is going to be very important as we go forward in working to ameliorating these primary threats on this ecosystem. So again, this is an exciting time for us, and we really appreciate this partnership and this approach moving forward. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Curtis.
All right, well, thank you, Dustin. Thanks for being such a great partner, and I want to thank Governor Otter as well for all of his support here in Idaho. So let's move on to our landowner in the room, Mr. Chris Black, who also is the chairman of the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission Board of Directors. So Chris, we're glad to have you here, and we're really interested in hearing from a landowner's perspective. What do you think?
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm glad to be here. And I will just give you a little bit of background on me. That always helps a little. We were longtime ranchers. My family moved. I ranch in Owyhee County in the Bruno area. My family moved there in 1875. So we're longtime ranchers, and I myself have been on the range for many years, since a very young age, so 48 years about. So I've seen many changes and many developments. When it became my opportunity to become steward in these lands, I chose to use holistic management as a method to manage. So this is the same sort of approach as all hands, all lands, taking all areas and forming them into this same idea. I won numerous awards in range management during my time from Society Range Management. I won a national award from BLM in 2008. So we've been at this for many, many years and worked on it. In Owyhee County, we believe in collaboration. I also sit on the board of the Owyhee Initiative, in which we solved the problem for wilderness in that part of the county, or work collaboratively with environmental groups and BLM and whatnot to create solutions. It's a work in progress, and we're still working on it. I also am chairman, as said, of the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission. What we were formed to do is to promote rangelands in the state of Idaho, because 65% of the state is rangeland, and so that is a huge economic benefit to the state that these rangelands are managed properly and whatnot. In a county like Hawaii County, more like 90 some odd percent is rangeland. So it's very important economically for the state of Idaho for these ranges to be managed properly. Getting to the all lands thing. This is what we're excited about, because even in a county like Hawaii County, we have it's 80% public land and thereabouts anyway, and 19 or 20% private. Well, among those, going along with that is it's about 80% of the mesic areas are on private land, on that 20% of private land, and that is key to wildlife. So this all hands, all lands approach and the outcome management initiatives from BLM are vital to what I see the future and going on into the future. And yeah, with that, I thank you, Curtis, for allowing me to be on here, and this is where it has to come from. Everyone has to get their act together, and then have to come from the ground up. All management has to, because I, as a rancher, have an economic. I make my whole living off the land, and always have. So I have a dog in this fight. With that, I'll thank Curtis.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, and you're definitely an integral part of this puzzle, that we're trying to put together here in Idaho for an all lands approach, holistic approach to grazing lands in the state of Idaho. So thank you very much for that. So with that, just wanted to I guess start out with I'll send it back to Kevin or Troy with that, if you want to take it from here, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Sorry, I didn't hear him. Let me scroll back up to that one. So Curtis, we got one quick one, a bit of a communication one, is, are all lands management and outcome-based management terms interchangeable? It's a bit confusing to me as a communicator.
Can I give that a try?
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
Okay, so I see them as different. All lands, that idea focuses on using different land ownerships on a watershed or on a large landscape scale, and so that creates opportunities across different ownerships. Outcome-based is really just about turning the focus away from prescriptions and times and numbers of animals to outcomes that are desired. So those outcomes could be in all lands, they could be within the umbrella of all lands approach, or they could be separate and really focus more just on outcomes and not on the mixing of different land ownerships. Does that clarify it at all?
Yeah, this is Troy. I think it does, and I don't want to. I'm going to open a complete bag of worms with my follow-up question, which is because it's a question that we've struggled with internally here at WGA, but I think more broadly as well. And I mean, I think I know what all lands means, but I'm not sure that I know what landscape scale means. And it seems like everybody that I talk to about landscape scale has a different definition or a different mental construct of what that means. And I'm just wondering if you guys dealt with that, or that was anything that was discussed as you guys approached the MOU, and what, if anything, was an outcome of those discussions?
Would anybody else like to elaborate on that?
Well, I think, and this is Dustin, I think really the focus is not just looking at, projects on, a private land project to benefit both wildlife, or modify grazing in a way that's beneficial for the livestock producer, but also benefit wildlife. But also think bigger, step that back, and how can that project then tie in with adjacent land ownerships? Maybe it's a state parcel where we could do some things. There's seasonal habitats for whatever species, I guess, maybe on that adjacent state parcel. How can we tie that in with this project we're doing on private lands, and then step that out maybe to BLM? Really, what else can we do to go bigger here to ensure that this truly is more of a landscape approach? Because, for example, livestock producers in Idaho use a mix of federal, state, and private ownership, and this one livestock producer may be using all three of those ownerships. So how, and whatever species may be in question is something that is utilizing that entire landscape. So how do we step that out from just maybe it's a wet meadow development project on Chris Black's ranch, and that's providing benefit to livestock and wildlife, but how do we step that out and improve conditions for wildlife and livestock on those adjacent parcels? Make these projects even bigger than just localized in those particular areas. And Chris, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, I can expand on that. This is a small, this isn't watershed based, but on my particular operation, I through the sage-grouse initiative, I just finished putting, actually the shortcoming in my operation is I don't have enough water. So through the sage-grouse initiative, I put in wells close to the edge of my private property that would water both BLM allotments, at least 2 in one, and inside fields in the other. But along with that, I added in wetlands, constructed wetlands for the benefit of wildlife. Fish and Wildlife Service loved that they put webcam, or put the trail cams up. You wouldn't believe how much wildlife came in. Elk, antelope, deer, sage-grouse. Use that just in the initial stages. So it's a project that benefits all. It's an all hands, all lands approach, basically, and that was the model, and that was what I see as the future for BLM, to use those models to use on their lands to draw cattle away from areas of concern and provide habitat. Now, this is a small-scale approach, but that's all hands and all lands. In my view, outcome-based management is different, but they work hand in hand to bring this holistic approach to management that is going to further all of our goals.
So go ahead, June.
Right, so this is June. And so to follow on a little bit what Chris was saying, I think that actually is a really good example of when you start talking about what is landscape, right? What is landscape, and how do you define that? I think if we spend a lot of time trying to define what landscape is, I think we end up boxing ourselves in and losing that flexibility we're actually looking for, right? So if you talk about a project like what, Chris, like what you did, it was a water project on your parcel that had a much bigger effect on the landscape. You know, we start talking about fuel breaks, let's say, that we do for BLM. You know, that might be a much larger area that we're actually doing those fuel breaks. So, you know, we're going to define landscape differently because we're protecting much bigger pieces that from fire. That's the ultimate goal for doing that. So, you know, I think landscape, I don't necessarily think there is an answer to what is landscape. I think we have to answer it every single time we talk about a project or start looking at a piece of land. I think we need to define what that is, but I think that we have to leave ourselves the flexibility to be able to have that conversation and not have ourselves in. So I'll offer that.
I just might add this, Chris Black, I might just add that in order to reach landscape goals, we have to take all the little pieces, and it takes little pieces put together that makes a landscape.
Couldn't agree with you more.
This is it, whether it's fire breaks or all of these individual pieces work and have to work together to make a whole landscape.
So with that, Chris, you know, I have a few questions of my own here, and talking about flexibilities and the needs for that across the landscape. And in terms of grazing land management, this is a question to all the panelists here. What does more flexible use across the landscape look like to you? Let's just elaborate a little bit more on that. And I'll repeat the question again. In terms of grazing land management, what does more flexible use across the landscape look like to you?
Well, I can take a stab at that. What it looks like to me is being able to utilize. Remember, I talked earlier about how my private grounds were so important. They're a small segment of the ecosystem or the watershed, but they were so important to wildlife. What it looks like to me is that if I can work with the public lands that I need to survive economically with, and work with them and mesh them together so that management across is uniform and works all through. We're not stressing the private ground, which is important for wildlife, at the expense of something else. So that would be my short answer to it.
Good answer, Bill. Thank you, Chris. Anyone else?
So this is June. I could say from our perspective, I think, you know, what flexibility would look like for BLM is really the ability to really practice adaptive management, something we talk about on a regular basis, but we really have a hard time actually doing. So in a situation where, you know, we have a weather event, like last year in Idaho, we had so much snow. So the spring we had a lot of growth, we had a lot of grass. Having the ability to make a decision at the point where we normally would pull cows off and say, you know, the permit actually says we're going to pull cows off, but, you know, we're looking at the fact that we have all of this grass. So how can we build flexibility into that permit to be able to say we're going to leave these cows out a little bit longer to be able to continue to eat down that forage for a couple of reasons. I mean, there is the economic, there is the social aspect, but there's there's a fuels reduction component of that too that I think that we need to pay attention to. So I think that's just an example of how we really feel like having that adaptive management ability to be able to be responsive in a much quicker fashion is going to be helpful.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, this is Dustin, and I think a lot of good things have already been said, but, you know, our focus is you know, if the resource warrants it, if the ecological condition is such that timing and duration of grazing can be altered to where you can keep livestock out there to achieve a resource benefit, i.e. fuel reduction in the stage step ecosystem, that's really important for us. Again, we've got not only sage grouse, but 350 other species out there that all are impacted by these same threats. And flexibility is moving forward is going to be very important if we're going to do anything to address those threats. You know, adjusting grazing to where, for example, livestock, it may be a spring permit, but maybe you can adjust things to where some fall grazing can occur to try to get on that green up, that cheatgrass green up, to try to set that back and allow more of the native perennials a chance to come on in the spring is a strategy that we'd like to see applied more on the landscape. But again, I can't emphasize enough, we've got the tools out there in the form of livestock. Let's change our thinking about this, that you know, livestock grazing can provide a lot of good benefits out there, you know, if we allow that to happen. And so I think, you know, this all lands approach to grazing management is very, very timely. You know, this is something that I know a lot of us have talked about in the past, but to see this white paper come out and a commitment by the agencies and others to move forward with trying some of this, and now with the BLM coming out saying, hey, we're gonna do some pilot projects now to see how we can apply this approach on the landscape is a great thing. So, you know, flexibility, let's utilize the tools we've got there.
Great. Thank you, Dustin. Karen, did you have any comments or additions to what's already been said?
It's always hard to have come in after such great good comments. I want to the reason we're having this discussion is because we're really living in a different era. We're in this era of rapidly changing technology and information and climate change. All of these things are really just coming to fruition in these last decade or so. And so we really do need some new tools. And oddly enough, those tools and the flexibility we're talking about are really kind of going back a few eras where we listened to the land and where we tried things in small scales and we just gave it a shot. And instead, we're stuck in an era where we find solace in prescriptions that are written in permits and such. And getting around those kind of prescriptions is the challenge here. But you know, we're having this discussion because we're really in a new era as far as I see.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. And, you know, we've been talking about all the advantages of creating working landscapes and applying outcome-based management strategies here. But I want to play a little devil's advocate here as well. And I want to ask the question to the panel members here, what impedes collaborative conservation in an all-lands approach? What are some impediments, I guess, in standing in our way, some barriers that we know of or we're kind of certain of running into?
Well, I guess I'll go first. This is Chris Black. Kind of the biggest impediment is rigid structured plans that aren't flexible, and that's something that's coming out with this outcome-based grazing and things like that. That's designed to put flexibility, and that's been the biggest problem in management all along from a producer's point of view, was this rigid approach to land management, and it doesn't provide the flexibility. Because nature is flexible. Nature is different every year. I've been out there 48 years and can't remember it the same year every year. You know, there's inherent flexibility. Well, you have to be able to roll with those punches. You have to be able to have that ability to do that. If you have that rigid structure, you just can't. So yes. And you have to have the technical expertise to be able to take advantage of that, and that's where a lot of the organizations, NRCS, and have wrote the book on a lot of the land management techniques and things. So that would be my biggest biggest answer.
And I, you know, coming from a landowner's perspective, I appreciate that so much. And, you know, I'll say this, I'll repeat this again, that, you know, if we don't have a landowner buy-in, we don't really have much here. So it really is, it depends on the landowner, their needs, their buy-in, their involvement, so on and so on. And so even though I'm moderating this today, And NRCS has taken a lead on this as other federal agencies, state agencies, but it's very, very important to know that the landowners' ownership on this and involvement and leadership on this is critical, in my opinion.
This is Chris. Just one more,
Yeah.
more comment, and that's the thing with NRCS. And I've worked with NRCS on my private land. It's voluntary conservation. So that means that I have buy-in in it, and I've come to them and presented an idea and worked through their programs to make it happen. So that's an approach that most landowners can deal with. They just need to have the flexibility within other agencies to make this a large-scale, all-hands approach.
Thank you, Chris.
This is Dustin. You know, I would say impediments to collaboration, really one being, you know, trust and lack of understanding. You know, oftentimes it's a challenge to get landowners and agency people together in the room because they may not know each other. There may be some misconceptions about each other. And I really do think that lack of trust and that lack of understanding each other can be a big impediment to collaboration. You know, it may sound a little cliche, but oftentimes once those two entities get to know each other, they realize that they have a lot more in common, you know, with each other than they don't. So that's a big thing for us, is developing those relationships and developing that trust. You know, that's very important if we're going to try to collaborate. And I guess the other thing is the lack of cohesive goals and shared vision. You know, if you don't have that, it all starts with getting to know each other and understand each other. But then you got to move into the shared goals and shared vision. And if you don't have that, it's going to be very hard to set up a collaborative and really move forward in a cohesive fashion. So those are a couple of things that I see as an impediment sometimes to collaboration.
And this is June. I mean, I completely agree with everything that's been said, but specifically with Dustin, his comments. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I think has made us so successful in Idaho is that we sat down at the table and really talked about things we could do together as opposed to focusing on the things that we couldn't. And I think that really clears away a lot of the animosity and really gets us moving in a positive direction. And so I think that's been, the relationships have been really key.
Thank you, June. And Karen.
I think something that is being said but maybe needs to be more overtly said, which is because of restrictions in federal land management opportunities, the NEPA and court-ordered mandates, etc., when you form a collaborative, it often goes to the person who has the most flexibility, which is the private land in the landscape. So what I'm hearing is I'm starting to talk more about landscape scale and all lands management, is that private landowners really have to be motivated because a lot of times they're the ones that can try it. They're the ones that can hold animals over. So Chris, I don't know, maybe you would want to address that point, but it's something that kind of I think is an obstacle, and it scares me that I'm asking so much of private landowners just because they are more flexible. Chris, what do you think?
Well, there are several considerations whenever we do projects, so to speak. I mean, they have to fit our economics. That's first and foremost. As a rancher, I have to put food on the table, and I have to provide food and fiber for the nation. Well, so projects have to work in that, and management has to work in that. And in my specific instance, in Hawaii County, where we are, 80% public lands, we have to work that with our private lands. We can only do so much on our private lands. The impacts of what we do on our private lands are bigger because of, like I referred to, for those magic areas, and they're the better areas. But there's only so much we can do. We need to work across these scales and tear down some of these barriers. The only way to do that is through collaboration and rolling up your sleeves and working on it.
So thank you, everybody, for that excellent discussion on that particular question. And to kind of elaborate on that a little bit more and lead off into a little bit different direction here, but do you think that a grazing management strategy like this developed through the collaborative effort will minimize or limit litigation and keep management decisions in the hands of resource professionals and not in the courts? So it's kind of a, yeah.
So this is June. I can speak to that, at least my thoughts on that. I mean, I think that a collaborative process opens the opportunities to try to minimize that, litigation. I think the more buy-in you have going in, the more it becomes part of sort of the way we do it and how we do it, and engaging with the public and engaging our NGOs and engaging our partners and even engaging the people that may not necessarily support where we're going, but try to at least having the conversation and having them sitting at the table and understanding the whys of it, I think is always going to be beneficial. So, I'm hopeful that it will help us. It will help us in the long term as far as reducing our litigation. I think more in the short term, what it will help with is having more durability in those decisions, because there's more people involved in them and understanding where we got. And I think that's that is probably going to help us more in the short term. So my thought on that.
Yeah.
This is Dustin, and I agree with what June just said, and and I really do feel that these landscape conservation effort collaboratives and initiatives do stand a better chance of succeeding in court than those things that are not put together under a collaborative format. One example of that here in Idaho has been the Idaho roadless rule, where we had the opportunity in the early 2000s to petition the Secretary of Agriculture to develop our own roadless rule in lieu of the Clinton era one-size-fits-all top-down approach. And so we did that. We petitioned the Secretary, and we got the opportunity to work with the Forest Service in 2 regions here in Idaho to develop our own plan. We did that collaboratively. We had a diverse group of stakeholders at the table to build that plan. And at the end of the day, it was litigated. The Idaho rule that we built together was litigated here in Idaho in the district court, but it was upheld. And it was also, upheld in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals as well upon the appeal. So the Idaho roadless rule is the law of the land. And really, going back to what the judge said during the litigation over the rule, he said this is good because this was built in a collaborative format. Everybody had to give and take, but at the end of the day, it succeeded because of the collaborative used to build it. So that's one example, and it's certainly a model that we try to continue to use here in Idaho in terms of resource conservation.
Couldn't agree with you more.
And I will just say that the management needs to be in the hands of resource professionals, but they don't need to have their eye on politics. They need to concentrate on management and on the land. In this day and age, most resource professionals have their eye on politics, so that influences a lot of the decisions. So I think that the collaborative approach would take that sort of and put that back into making correct decisions for the landscape and for everything.
All right. Karen, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, I think those are all really great comments. I will just go back to echo to what June said initially, is that they're all great outcomes of collaboration, but collaboration is a lot of work. So there's big payoffs, but it really does take some, and my hat is off to those people who sit at the table and do it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, panelists. you know, for that great discussion again. And at this point in time, I'd like to turn it back to the Governors Association and allow them to, I guess, go through some questions from our participants today.
Great. Thanks, Curtis. That was a really great discussion, and we have a few really good questions lined up for you. So here's the first one. How successful have you been in developing flexible grazing permits that promote mutual goals for conservation and production? Have those permits, if any, been successful in achieving outcome-based goals?
So this is June. You know, we're really just starting to move down the road and looking at that. You know, I mean, we're not at the point yet where we've actually issued, at least not to my knowledge in Idaho, that we have not issued any quote-unquote outcome-based grazing permit renewals. But we are engaging actively with the permittees and talking about the things that are happening on the lands, the things that need to happen on the lands, and how we can write that into those permits and develop more outcome-based type permits and get away from sort of the standards terms and conditions. So that is something that we're doing. And we also are looking at the flexibility we have within our current regulations that give us flexibility with the actual permits we have in place now to be able to look maybe at more of an outcome-based results with some of the terms and conditions.
Thank you, Jim.
This is Chris, and I just want to mention that your fire breaks is an example of outcome-based. It's not permit-wide, but that's a fine example of where you can aim for an outcome and get, and Idaho's been the lead in that.
All right, I think we're ready for our next question.
Great. What is the best science telling you about best grazing practices? I'm interested in specific examples.
You want to repeat that question one more time, please?
Sure. What is the science telling you about best grazing practices? I'm interested in specific examples.
I'll give a stab and then others could tap in. So I'm thinking about one of the newest maybe terms that's really coming to fruition and really trying to hone down grazing management is targeted grazing. So the idea and one of the new approaches is to really focus on how can we apply animals at the right time, the right species with the right background, and really accomplish landscape goals. So there's a switch really from just kind of following general rules to having very specific landscape or very site-specific examples. So I think some of the newest stuff that's coming out on grazing cheatgrass is very interesting. A few years ago, people thought that cows didn't eat it much, and it was just a problem, and they were certainly promoting it. And there's sort of several sides of the story that we're starting to learn now, which is, you know, grazing in the winter can be very effective. They've been doing some really good research in Nevada about winter grazing and also Oregon to reduce cheatgrass. In the spring, early grazing before the perennials come on and become susceptible to grazing can be very effective. But then you do have to get off of the range when the perennials start to come on and become susceptible, because if you don't, then you promote the cheatgrass. And one other piece of this that we don't know too much is what fall grazing might do. I think there could be some real benefits to fall grazing. So that's just a specific example of how timing is really critical in the case of cheatgrass. It's not a yes or no question, it's a when question.
Great, thank you, Karen.
I'll just jump in on that, and I'm not going to give you any science-based ones, but I'm going to say that each situation is different. You can't prescribe a grazing technique or anything for the whole ecosystem, because each area in the watershed is different. So you have to take that into consideration. Grazing management isn't science, it's an art. So that's where the art part of it comes in. It's science and art mixed, and that's where it comes in. Yes.
Completely agree with you, Chris, on that. Do any of the other panelists have any additional comments on that? If not, I believe we are ready for our next question.
All righty, next one here. When moving from a prescription approach to an outcome approach, how do you establish metrics and a practical monitoring program that all stakeholders agree with and trust? Can read that one more time if you want.
Sure, that'd be great. One more time.
When moving from a prescription approach to an outcome approach, how do you establish metrics and a practical monitoring program that all stakeholders agree with and trust?
This is Karen, and I'll start out, and hopefully one of the rest of you will chime in. But I think, boy, that hits on the real challenge with applying an outcome-based approach, is to find a metric that that is effective. The questioner did have the right emphasis, which is happening to find something that everyone involved says, yeah, if this happened, that would mean this, that this is a good indicator of what's going on. The more inherent challenge is that with outcome-based grazing, we're really trying to focus on ecological, social, and economic. So although we as a science, rangeland science, and art, Chris, I appreciate that comment, we are pretty good at doing ecological, looking at the land and having it tell us, not always as good at the economic and social side. So I think all three of those have to come together, and a group, very site-specific group, has to come up with things to measure that would say that the outcome was achieved or was not achieved. But to be completely honest, I think we're at the infancy of creating those metrics.
So this is June, and just to follow on a little bit with what Karen said, you know, one of the things that this is one of the things we're very concerned with, obviously, at BLM, about how we actually monitor that, how we show results, and again, also looking at the social and economic piece, which is not something we normally spend a lot of time looking at, and understanding clearly that we're going to need to employ a different set of skills to be able to look at that. You know, right now, what we have in this, with Idaho BLM, we have an agreement with the State Department of Agriculture, and then we have a monitoring agreement that we actually have people that work on that on a regular basis, have lots of conversation about what kind of monitoring we do, what our requirements are, and then the State Department of Ag works with permittees to actually have that instruction and facilitate the understanding so that we're all clear on what the expectations are, and making sure that if they're doing monitoring, it's actually monitoring that we can use as part of our process. So, I mean, we already have a pretty collaborative approach to what that looks like, and have a flexible system, I think, that's going to allow us to really take whatever the determination is on the outcome-based monitoring needs, and actually roll that into a process. So I think that part we at least have sort of a start with. But the social and the economic piece, you know, we've been talking about engaging different sort of social and economic scientists through the universities, and even internally in our agency, to start having those conversations about how do you actually measure that, what does that look like. So that's something that we have at least started on talking about.
Yeah, just real quick, this is Dustin. You know, this is a new concept, obviously, for us, and this is going to take time to piece this all together, really, in terms of metrics. It's going to take, like what BLM is doing now, more the pilot project approach, to start doing some studies here to where we can set up those metrics, and then work very collaboratively with our stakeholders to ensure that you know, we're not missing the mark, not missing anything, and that we can develop that trust and really have durable metrics that people can rally behind. So it's a different way of doing business, but certainly this is we're really in our infancy here.
And this is Chris, and from my perspective, you know, that each agency has their specific needs for monitoring and whatnot, but as long as we can build that trust in monitoring techniques and things like June was talking about with BLM and the Department of Ag, as long as we can build that trust, one of the best people to monitor are the ranchers themselves, because they're out there making a living, they're seeing all the changes, and they have a vested interest in that landscape and in what they do. So, and a lot of times their information is a lot better if put in the right format.
Well said, Chris. Everyone else, I believe we're ready for our next question.
Great. All right, so this one's a bit more general. Is this landscape approach being pushed throughout the western states or just Idaho? Do you know of any examples? One of the big issues we have in Arizona is federal agencies dictating grazing seasons without talking to the state lands.
So,
June, go ahead.
sure, so this is June. So a couple things. One, yeah, landscape approach is being pushed out throughout all this western states. So it's actually a national initiative for us. So everyone is working on it. I can speak specifically a little to Arizona just because that's where I was previously to coming up here a year and a half ago. Ray Suazo is the state director in Arizona, and he's very, very committed to this. He's actually one of the co-lead with the state director of Idaho, Tim Murphy, on moving this forward and actually working through this national initiative. So it is something that I think all the states are going to see more and more of. And I think I think exactly what your point with the question, who asked that question, that the big issue with the dictation of the grazing seasons without talking to state lands. I think what we're talking about here in Idaho is a model that we've put together that we always are going to have issues. It just happens. But I mean, I think we have a framework in place to try to overcome those issues. And I think that's something that is part of this bigger national initiative is really something that we're hoping to be able to move that to the other states and try to assist in the development of a much better collaborative process between the federal agencies and the state and then the local folks. So hopefully you guys down in Arizona will be seeing that sooner than later and being able to sort of play in that arena, because it's actually a pretty cool opportunity to be able to really set the course together with the federal agencies and the state agencies and move on that.
So I'll just add on to that too as well. I mean, we as federal agencies, the last thing we want to be is a dictator of how this is all going to work. Like I said earlier in our discussion, the important factor or the important person in the room is the landowner. And what are the needs of a landowner? What are the needs that the landscape is actually telling us what is best for the land? So that's really what we need to do and get away from this dictating at the federal level, I guess. I'll just say real openly and honestly. We are a science-based agency, NRCS, and we have the tools in the toolbox to provide the alternatives and the options that the landowner can decide, but it's ultimately their decision in what we do, and we just provide them with some alternative methods of how to get the job done out there. So I think we're ready for the next question.
Sure, this is Bill with WGA. I spend a lot of my time looking at invasive species and how grazing can be used as a management tool with them. And one of the most, I think we all know, the most high-profile species is in western rangelands is invasive species is cheatgrass. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about other invasive species that can be controlled with the use of grazing management or other pilot programs or research programs that are going on to investigate other ways to use targeted grazing to control invasive species, and what would those be?
I'll start that. Again, if someone will chip in. So through my research and work that I do with a targeted grazing committee from the Society for Range Management and others, some of the most successful cases are, I think we're on the edge of really being able to use grazing effectively with cheatgrass, as you mentioned. Also, yellow star thistle can be quite effectively managed with goat grazing. Leafy spurge has been successfully managed in the northern Great Plains with sheep and goat grazing. Of course, cattle can be used oftentimes for fuel. That would be the choice for that, or horses even. But there are some other ones that are much more difficult. Things like the juniper that we have, western juniper, is difficult to manage with targeted grazing. Salt cedar is also very difficult. So there is a span, but there is maybe a dozen or so that are can really pretty effectively be managed with targeted grazing.
All right, thank you, Bill, for that question. Thank you, Karen. Does anyone else on the panel have anything else to add?
I might say that as far as invasives and cheatgrass, the best way to solve that problem is through pushing succession to a higher level, and that involves grazing and grazing management, the flexibility in grazing management to apply those tools.
Updated. I think we're ready for next question.
Folks, this is Troy, and I guess the question I've got, it sort of follows on Bill's question about multiple uses for that grazing, and you guys discussed it a little earlier, the use of grazing as a fuels reduction tool, and I guess I'd ask you to expand on that a little bit, and maybe if you're going to use, or if we were to use grazing as one of the tools to maximize that kind of wildfire mitigation, are there what would you do differently, or what are there elements that we need to take into account when you look at it through that wildfire frame? So I guess that's one question. So thanks.
Sure, this is Dustin, and for us it's all about timing, duration, and intensity, and really what are your objectives here? Targeted grazing is something that is a useful tool when applied appropriately, and you got to ensure that you know what your objectives are. So for example, for protecting core sage-grouse habitat, there may be some areas either within core habitat or adjacent to core habitat where you might want to modify your grazing in a way to where you can reduce those invasive annual grasses at the right time of year to decrease the susceptibility of that core habitat being burned over in a wildfire. So just being strategic about how we use livestock grazing for really, building fuel breaks is something that is within our state sage-grouse strategy. Let's utilize, again, I sound like a broken record, but let's utilize the tools we have out there and break down some of these barriers and red tape and actually apply some of this on the landscape the right way. We also used livestock grazing to help us build a fuel break around the soda fire burn, where we've made some investments through, again, that was all done collaboratively, investments to restore nearly 300,000 acres burned up a couple of years ago in the soda fire, which a lot of that is important sage-grouse habitat. We did use targeted livestock grazing to help build a fuel break around that, and it was effective. So it really comes down to ensuring you know what your objectives are, what you're trying to do, timing, and duration and intensity. Anybody else want to add on to that?
Pretty much it.
I cover it? Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dustin. Next question, please.
All right, so we have two questions that I'm going to ask together because they're pretty related. So question number one is, it seems like the land management plan revision process is a great opportunity to institutionalize outcome-based grazing. Are there any efforts to align upcoming revisions in Idaho to this concept? And then the second half of that is, can June speak to what BLM is doing and what we can do to assist in incorporating the flexibility she speaks of, adaptive management, into BLM land management plans?
So I think the question was applying this all lands approach to grazing management through the land use plan process, where the process we're currently going through to discuss plan amendments, this notice of intent, scoping period. And I would say yes. And if I go back to, the governor's sage-grouse strategy, we talk about a lot of this stuff. Outcome-based grazing, utilizing livestock grazing to achieve certain objectives out there within sage-grouse habitat, namely to reduce fuel loading and try to protect some of the best habitat. So that's certainly something that we would like to get to, speaking on behalf of the governor and the state of Idaho, through this land use plan amendment process. We do have some concerns with the current grazing framework within the federal plans, and in fact we think it's far too restrictive, and it's going to tie the hands of a lot of our resource managers. And one of the big concerns for us too through that process is the lack of certainty and predictability for grazers through the current federal land use plan amendment. So that's the grazing piece of that is something that we're certainly going to weigh in on, speaking again on behalf of the state of Idaho through this process, because we really do want to achieve some solid objectives through grazing management out there, through outside the box thinking, through collaborative grazing management, and again utilizing these resources that we have out there to achieve these objectives. We need that flexibility, and I think through this land use plan amendment process we can sort of get things back on track and really refocused again on what we were trying to do collaboratively a few years ago before things kind of changed on us at the 11th hour through this land use plan amendment, or the land use planning process a couple of years ago. Would you like to add on to that, anybody?
Well, I can speak specifically to the what you folks can do to to sort of help this outcome-based process as we move forward through land use planning processes. And I think speaking specifically for Idaho, and Karen, you might want to jump in after I'm done here. We work closely with a team that's pulled together with the University of Idaho, Boise State, and various stakeholders across the state. And ultimately, what the goal of that group is to try to come up with sort of what are the needs out there, and how can we actually get at them? So what are some of these outcome-based, what are some of the outcomes that people want to get to, and how could we actually roll that into our current process for permit renewals within the current framework and the current laws and regulations that we have, and then also what is sort of sitting on the outside that we can't get to right now, but ultimately could potentially look at regulation rewrites, or or that the team can work with legislators to try to get maybe some changes in the law as far as how we actually would be able to implement those things. So that's something, getting engaged in that process I think is going to be really important. And I think we're going to have a series, Karen, is that 5 focus groups that are going to happen in Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's about right, June.
Right. And so, ultimately getting involved with that process and making your voices heard of what you guys need out there to really develop that flexibility, I think is going to be a really important part of the process. And, even though that is just focused right now, really, we're really focused in Idaho, and we're pulling in Nevada and Oregon. So the idea is that information is going to funnel up and will help guide the national policy making as far as what that looks like. So that's what I can offer as far as, I think, as a way of getting involved and being able to really affect that change.
Yes, June, thank you so much. And I wish I had like a number to call, but they're in the phase of trying to get those focus groups together. And I also think you framed it really, really well. There's sort of 2 ways to look at making this move forward. One is to find local solutions and do some pilot projects and some case studies and see what works in specific places with local ideas and local solutions. So that's one approach. And then the other is to look up and say, well, what is really out there that we can't quite grab it now? What are the policy issues that are restricting opportunities? So that process that Dennis Becker is leading is both kind of top up and top down, or bottom up and top down. So I think it'll be interesting in the next 6 months or so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, all of you. And I think we're ready for our next question.
Great, Curtis. I think this is going to be our final question, and I think it's a good one to end on. Here it is. I'd like to hear more from the panel on the strategy for identifying the outcomes in the pilot projects that are being proposed.
That is a good question. You'd like to go first? All right.
So I will harken back very quickly to what I said in the sort of in the outset of the intro, you know, we're learning as we go. So right now what our plan is the field offices are reaching out down to permittees that seem like likely candidates for this kind of work, working with them on when their permits are coming up, what's currently in their permits, what maybe needs to change, and we need to get sort of queued up for as far as permit renewals as that 10-year period elapses. And then really working very closely with the groups within the field offices, so the BLM folks, and then working with the permittees, and then the other folks that are also in those landscape areas, different NGOs, different groups. There's a lot of interest, not just with the permittees of this, but also with a lot of the environmental groups, a lot of the range community, the different cattle associations, et cetera. So the idea would be that everyone would sit down and actually talk about what that outcome would look like for those different pieces of land. So I think that's the sort of the baby steps we're taking right now on identifying these sort of pilot projects. I mean, ultimately, I think what we'd like to get to is really where we look at the whole field office, the whole district, or the whole area, how that bumps up against private lands, state land, and how we all will come together at different times to be able to really talk about what do we need to do in order to move the ecological function of these areas forward, you know, to improve them, and what would that look like, and actually, you know, really setting a target for ourselves, and then figuring out how we're actually going to get there and building that into the permit. I think that ultimately would be the place we want to go to. So it's really more of a collaborative. It's a collaborative process on how we get to whatever that outcome is going to be as part of that permit. And it really feeds a much bigger conversation or a bigger vision for that piece of land, or that landscape, if that helps.
Thank you, Jim.
This is Karen, and there are a lot of different ways to think about these pilot studies or pilot projects, and some are coming out of BLM. I want to let you know what Dennis Becker with the Policy Analysis Group, and again working with John Freemuth in the Andrus Center. The approach that they're taking is to talk to a bunch of people and say, what are some challenges that are common on the landscape? And so, for example, if we could have as an outcome reduced frequency, size, and intensity of fire on landscapes. Well, you know, if that was the outcome, then where might we look for a pilot study where we could really play around with opportunities to really get at that? So that group is first starting with what are some common challenges people are facing and some common obstacles. And so then they're going to look for places on the ground to address those. So that it's just a little bit of a different way of looking at it. But they will also be having policy analysis type of case studies and pilot studies happening hopefully next summer.
Okay. This is Chris Black, and you know, just a piece of advice from an old rancher. You know, reaching out to ranchers for ideas. That's the biggest thing, because and I learned this by working with NRCS. They reach out. It's voluntary conservation. They reach out to provide what's needed on the landscape within the regulations and within the vision that the person has. So reaching out to that level would really help with BLM and whatnot to attain those goals, because the ranchers most likely have thought about it and have ideas that can reach those goals in targeted grazing or reach whatever. So that's just.
Thank you, Chris. Dustin, do you have anything else to add? Or all right. So I guess, you know, that I just want to say here in closing that unified, we're so much stronger, as is what we've alluded to here today and demonstrated. I hope the unification, the trust that we have, and I just want to say I'm so grateful here in Idaho, the relationships that we've been able to build, and the trust within. We get a lot more done. And I also want to thank our four panelists here today for their time and sharing with us their professional and personal perspectives and their support for outcome-based land management collaboratively across the land. So thank you, all of you who participated in today's webinar. And a huge thank you to the Western Governors Association for making this public information webinar possible. So with that, I want to, I guess, turn it back to you.
Thanks, Curtis. This is Troy Timmons, and definitely appreciate all of you guys and ladies joining us for this webinar. Incredibly enlightening in terms of what you guys have been able to accomplish there in Idaho, and hopefully we'll see more of these types of approaches, collaborative approaches on this and other issues throughout the western states. It's really been a great hour and a half, and I can't believe that we've already used up that entire amount of time. One thing I need to say is that you guys will have, NRCS Idaho will have a copy of the white paper up on your website if folks want to check that out. If you'd like to listen through or refer someone else to this webinar, this will be posted on WGA's YouTube site. You can find that either just at YouTube or go to westgov.org and follow the links through the National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative. You'll get to the webinar series eventually. Again, really appreciate everybody who participated, our panelists and moderator Curtis Elke. Appreciate all of you who attended and listened in and that provided questions. There were a lot of great questions and a lot of awesome questions that we didn't have time to get to. So really appreciate the thoughtfulness involved there. And with that, I think we are done with today's webinar. Thanks again for attending, folks. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.